So when, this 9 rupees an hour, it was quite devastating to discover that today, this day and age, the people can earn 100 rupees. What can somebody do with that 100 rupees a day? They have 2 children and they have a family to run, 3,000 rupees a month. That's assuming that they don't take, a single day off. They work, right? You're literally expecting them to work like machines with no downtime at all through the year to make this basic 9 rupees an hour. And what was the product that they were making? This was something gifted to Queen Victoria when she visited India in the early 1900s, which means it was a product which was of a very high standard, in sophistication. People who make fan are this kind of money, right? So that staggering inequality in wages, the kind of value that we give for somebody's art, right? And not even calling it art. It's only, called as craft, which is a product of great replicability, right? So where there's no two mats that are alike. So the people, the women who make those flow mats, they inspired me to come up with the title 9 rupees an hour, and also because, I work with a journalist, Saina, as part of the People's Archive of Rural India, where we are making many of these stories visible. So that is one of the places where it came across, and where it came together as a book. I did some of the stories, for the book, especially.
Thank you, Aparna, for clarifying, giving us knowledge about why this title. It is very, very much connecting to what women face actually when they get into these kinds of jobs. But this book also provides a wonderful landscape of lots of definitions actually, and giving clarity about terms that are floating around, which we understand in a very shallow way, like livelihood, skilled, unskilled labor, caste, art, and culture, and craft. So I would like you to put a bit of light on these terms and how you understand and define in a very broad way, not just in a very shallow way. Looking from just one lens, you look at from multiple lenses and try to understand these terms in a much holistic way.
So thank you. I'm so glad you like the definitions, because when we were writing, when the editor and I were discussing about this book, one of the things that I did want to say is, talk about things like livelihood and art and craft, because we use these words so loosely and interchangeably. We don't talk about livelihood as different from job. We almost, say the same thing. Like I would call myself as having a livelihood, but I don't have a livelihood. I have a job, which means that there is a permanence, which means that if this goes, I can get something else. So I asked my teacher, Zaina. He told me this about livelihoods. So what is a livelihood? Zaina defines it as work that supports a person's life and is sustained by natural and sometimes related social and cultural resources. That takes care of the practitioner's essential needs across a lifespan, even if their earnings seem meager or irregular to a city dweller. And the important thing is, when the resource vanishes, the livelihood vanishes. That is the most important point. And today those resources are vanishing.
Very timely discussion, I must say. I'm a political economist about a lot of resources and its connection with the population's livelihoods, the dependence. And this is the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. Like we said, resources disappear, livelihoods also disappear, because we have lots of so-called green jobs being created in our country because people work on natural resources, their conservation, their rejuvenation, replenishment, and other things. And I work with very sophisticated models myself, like livelihood models we talk about livelihood assets, livelihood outcomes, the strategies, all these terms of putting around models are there, but when the livelihood doesn't exist, these models are of no use. That takes me to the next question, in fact, Aparna. Are all livelihoods equally affected, when we look at Tamil Nadu? Or throw some light on caste and gender aspect. I'll come to this directly, then I'll come back to another basic question. So I think I'll just highlight, because it is we are inclusive these days. We talk so much about inclusive planning and inclusive growth, and as well as we talk about in case of the agrarian community these days, highlight has been on millet production, where women farmers are engaged. So I'll just help to understand this aspect.
So I think when we talk about livelihoods itself, it means that there are certain people who are more privileged than others. One is directly is because of gender, men are more privileged. And the other one is, of course, the caste aspect. There are people who are at the intersection of caste and gender, Dalit women, for example, who face the worst of, any kind of disruption, any kind of, issue, resource, access to resources, everything, it affects them more. I think like what we were discussing, so kind of, when we say the word farmer, who comes to our mind? It is usually always a man. It is a man with a dhoti standing in front, of a plow. Maybe there are bullocks in front. Or if we look at, a modern farmer, we think about a man wearing trousers on a tractor. It is never a woman unless we're thinking about transplanting and we think about a row of women who are standing, in a slushy field and they're moving rice from one point to another. So, I mean that, our language, the way we look at all these livelihoods is very discriminatory. I mean, we are looking at men. So all the interventions that we are looking at, all the solutions that we are looking at will also, go where our gaze goes. So our gaze only goes there. And one of the reasons is also because of, journalism, media is focused on only certain livelihoods, which are more visible, which are closer to the city, which if it disappears tomorrow, we're going to have a problem. So if you look at farming, we're talking about wheat and rice farmers predominantly, because those are heavily consumed across the country. For millets, we actually need to produce so much of money to see that these millets are grown and to consume, because we have to make it popular. Whereas we were a millet growing society, we were a millet eating society, but we have to make it popular by, throwing money around, just like we throw seeds around. So it's kind of very ironical. And caste is, it's a huge issue. I mean, we have the landowning caste and we have the agricultural laborers, many of whom do not come into the purview of, the farming community. And the moment they don't come in, they don't have access to bank loans, if they don't have a patta in their name, they cannot get any compensation if there is any issue. So it's multiple, and many of the landowning people are now becoming laborers because they are losing their land. Saina found out that on average every single day in India 20-40 people were leaving agriculture.
So look at incidentally or luckily getting a flagship study of my institute on doubling farmers' income. So very, very interesting to understand, kind of dilemma we are facing currently. First of all, there's hardly any income available to farmers. I'm talking about doubling, and what is to be doubled? This not even minimum is being earned, and we're trying to double this farmers' income. And then another, I would say, intervention is to be made. A lot of stress is being given by the government these days on local natural farming, which again requires huge shift from the practices we have now to natural farming or zero budget natural farming. They don't have to use any external inputs except cow dung and cow urine to produce this. And these farmers bear the brunt. The small and marginalized communities bear the brunt, not the big farmers who will not do that. So that takes me to the question in case of Tamil Nadu. What are some of the livelihoods besides farming? There are a couple of other activities happening at these community level. What are the livelihoods that exist in Tamil Nadu and elsewhere also? And which are under threat especially. That's what is the title of the book. They disappear soon. If not taken care of, you don't make suitable policies for them. Don't give them enough incentive to actually continue these practices in future. So, what is your take on this?
Thank you, madam. So, I think that's the most important thing. When we say, agrarian livelihoods, our broad understanding is 50% of India is involved in farming. So, not all 50% are actually being full-time cultivators. They're all in some way, associated with the agrarian world. And those could be things like people who are making implements for this, like sickle makers, people who are making musical instruments. And why would musical instrument get affected by, fallen farming is only if the farming communities have money, they will have, certain kind of wedding where they will have musical instruments, musicians coming and playing. And if musicians are not there, you don't have musical instruments. So the whole thing is very, very, deeply intertwined. And that intertwining, if we have two successive droughts, for example, the whole thing comes crashing down because 70% of India depends on groundwater for farming. 70%. It's a huge number. So our country, that way, we are having these, tensions and conflicts because of 70% of India, 80% of, drinking resources and 90% of industry is dependent on groundwater. And we have groundwater going lower and lower, and parts of Tamil Nadu, possibly other areas as well, where we reach 1,000 feet for groundwater. And we still have caste determining who uses that water. Women will have to travel longer distances to get one pot of water for their drinking and cooking. Whereas, there will be some people like me, who live in a city. I open my tap, I always get water. That is, my position, my privilege that, I get it. Right? So it's not like, I've done anything to deserve that water any more than somebody else has done something to not deserve it. So the livelihoods are across the board under threat, whether it's art, whether it is agrarian, and all of it has a direct bearing on our culture. And when these livelihoods disappear, it's going to impact our culture as well.
Well, two things impressed me a lot. The most I would say that there's a small, saying by Cho Dharma in the very beginning of your book, in the introduction chapter. It says, when a livelihood dies, a way of life vanishes. And the language too is diminished. This is one thing which impressed me a lot. Secondly, like this said, we talk so much about subsidies by the government, for various, we say agriculture is the most subsidized sector, and what is subsidized? So-called green revolution, which I think did most of the damage to the soils of these farms and what would have been otherwise if we had not gone with such an intensive kind of chemical-based farming. So you rightly said in your book, the interesting title which goes, these farmers subsidize actually government, not the government subsidizes farmers. So I just throw light on what you mean by this.
Sure. So if you look at the price of 1 kg of ladies finger, for example, on average in Chennai, I buy it say between 40 and 60 rupees. Right? But to harvest that 1 kg of ladies finger from say 1 acre of land, you typically have 6 people working on it. Actually, paddy and wheat are less labor intensive than say vegetables or fruits, and none of these farmers have any say on the final buying price. Tomato, as we know very rightly, goes from 1 rupee to 120 rupees. Onion goes from 0 to 100. So the farmer actually has no control on the prices. Who determines the price? We say the market. Who is the market? All of us are the market, right? It's not just the government, although the government plays a big role, the state plays a big role, but all of us are the market. So when we look at the input cost going up and the output cost going down, the farmer has very little to do there. They cannot reduce their labor, they cannot reduce their input cost, they cannot, X cannot get reduced, but Y always, has a fluctuation. So in that way, it is they who are subsidizing us. When it goes down to a very low price, they are basically making my life easy. The moment tomato rice falls, I know all our WhatsApp groups are buzzing with tomato people and tomato jam recipes.
Yes.
It's like we are enjoying the fruits of their labor in that sense.
I think very essential to complement the production system with the most of the value chain, of agriculture. And we don't have enough transportation activities or support system. Not much of warehousing, no grading is being done, no certifications being provided. So you are selling the same thing, different thing at the same price in the market. Like give an example of organic farming in Sikkim state, because the state is organic.
Right.
But when these farmers are brought to a market which is sell their products, they have to compete with the other products.
Absolutely.
And they can't charge additional price. There's no such certification being given to them to should premium on that value. So this kind of dilemma exists. But is it the only economics issue, or the other factors like ecological or some other factors and the tensions and conflicts also arise because of these kinds of variating economic situations, variating ecological situations which farmers face?
So, I think it is not an economic issue. In the sense that we can't throw money at this problem and hope to fix it, for example. There are other issues, like I think right now the worst thing that they are facing is climate change. So there is this whole thing of the entire monsoon coming in a very short period of time, where people are either losing their crop completely or they're getting too much water and they don't have a means to store it, like in Tamil Nadu. Because where there used to be a lake one generation ago, now there is a bus stand or a fancy, wedding hall. So they have lost, the way to means to kind of store that water. The other thing is the stigmas that are associated with some occupations. Those stigmas are because these occupations are practiced by people of a certain caste, especially when it comes to crafts and arts. It is very, very hierarchical. Or even if you look at palm tree climbing, in Tamil Nadu there was only one caste, which was practicing it. So they were stigmatized to such an extent that even when they go to a doctor, when their children fall ill, they have the caste thrown back at them, saying that, oh, you belong to that caste, and they are humiliated. So until that is there, until society does nothing to remove these stigmas, even if there is none, there is going to be no, strengthening of these livelihoods.
I think adding to what you said in terms of climate change affecting rather these farmers greatly. And what else is greatly affected them is the lack of the diminishing biodiversity, disappearing biodiversity. I remember, as a student, in many temples of India, every day a different variety of rice is being used to offer Islam. Now we don't even have 365 is just a small number. They're producing 1,000 varieties of rice across the entire landscape, which is simply because there's a demand existing for them. So this is another factor in biodiversity means climate change means safety nets means resilience in the system which is disappearing. We are too much wheat and rice centric definitely, which is distorted the entire culture of the fabric of biodiversity in the country as well. But connecting to that, how do you see given this situation, given the policy backdrop, given the institutional system, given the market mechanism, given the lack of GI kind of tagging to these crops, how do you see the future of livelihoods in the country?
It's going to be very, very difficult if we do not strengthen the profitability. We are, I think, focusing a lot on productivity, but not enough on profitability. I think the moment, all our focus is on hybrids. We are talking about GM, we're talking about hybrids, we're talking about more inputs, more intensive inputs so that we get a better crop. But unless we give an MSP for the crop and actually maintain that MSP, there is going to be no profitability. Without profitability, who will want to do it? So I think, our fix should be if there is 1 acre of land, if that 1 acre of land fetches 25 lakhs, is the farmer better off, selling that land, putting the money in the bank, getting an interest from it and living, like a happy life, which is what you and I would do, logically, right? So why can't the farmer be assured the same income they would get, from that 1 acre, if they do farm? So that means that in that region, what should work, should be given to them. It can't be that rice is, grown or sugarcane is grown in a water deficient area, or even cotton. So
you took a wonderful journey across the state of Tamil Nadu, across various districts to understand these, conflicting situations, these scenarios. So I'd just like you to read few paragraphs from your book. Especially, I would like you to tell more about the picture of your book, the palm collective climbers, which climb up to the palm trees. So situations or examples and cases which motivated you, which touched you, which also disturbed you. So because that's what is required. This shows the scope of work we need to do to improve the conditions of these farmers and improve their livelihoods. So just wanted to read 1 or 2 paragraphs.
Thank you, ma'am. So I think the story that really moved me the most was this one about the palm tree climbers. Basically because, I have seen people climb coconut trees, in my childhood, because we had coconut trees at home. One gentleman would come and then, pluck the coconuts, and my grandmother would give him whatever he wanted, the money. But somebody actually to do this, every single day, I only realized it when I went to that village. So I read one small paragraph about, what they do. Sarate, sarate, sarate. A short, muscular man shimmies down a palm tree in a minute, placing his right foot here, his left foot there, and lands gracefully on the ground. 54-year-old Anthony Rayappan scales the equivalent of Mount Everest in a week during the season. It is what keeps him and his family from going hungry. And what does his wife do? Once he goes up and down, a tree and collects the sand. So this is actually another woman in the village. About 500 meters from Rosari's empty work hut, Munirma sat and nursed. Smoke curled up from the chimney and hung around, shimmering black in the heat of the afternoon. Her husband, Rajendran Chelasani, like Ayappan, was just back from tapping Padalir. On a good day, Munirma stuck inside the hut for at least 9 hours, swallowing up 3 batches of karpati. Every minute she's inside, bent over or crouched next to the wood fire. She's breathing in fumes, her face is scorched and her eyes smart and tear. None of my sisters were married to palm tree climbers, she said, sighing and stirring. My parents did this work. I was a 4th daughter. My sister's husband worked on salt pans, but they got me married to him, she pointed outside, where Rajendran was cutting palm fronds. Despite her angst, she did not once curse her job. Invited to talk about the process and her routine, she spoke at length about the upkeep of the mud star. That's what moved me, ma'am. She was not cursing the job. She was not, she was very accepting of her situation. And even when I asked her to speak, she was talking about the mud star. She said that had to be strengthened. The strength of the mud star was basically the strength of her family's, income. It is astonishing because she was a woman who was my age, and our lives could not have been more different. So that really, showed a mirror to my privilege.
So, it's been a traditional practice and so, So बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग क्वेश्चन दिमाग में आया जब आपने palm tree climbers की बात करी. I mean that there's no such mechanism being worked out where these people can easily reach to the top to collect the sand. Of course, you talk about mission on Mars, which is a rocket science. This could not be rocket science; it is a simple solution. So, did you find such answer to these kind of queries? Did they try or anybody attempted any kind of
Looks like
research?
some of these people are doing, but we're not getting to an easy, scalable, replicable model. So we are getting, the one-off intervention from an IIT. So somebody, and then it becomes a big news. But the everyday lives of the people is not news. That remains something which is, buried, invisibilized because of the caste and, classification. So, and the only time we talk about people is when, either they have a terrible death or when there is, a child from that family becomes an IAS officer, then we say, oh my God, look at this, this family has produced an IAS officer. So we celebrate that, we talk about the death, but the everyday life, the process, which is actually what will bring us a solution, is not being discussed enough.
So, what happens, always we blame the government, blame agencies that they're not doing enough. कुछ नहीं कर रहे हैं, बहुत काम किया है और उनका बहुत अलग-अलग प्रायोरिटीज हैं. लेकिन as a citizen, as an individual, we also have duties towards them. It's called a soft approach. It is not following a typical hard approach of putting everything on the shoulder of the government. We are also the government. We make the government. We are a democratic country, and democracy is for the people, by the people, and blindly. So, how do you see role that individual can play in the livelihoods of these down-to-earth communities, the farmers, the artisans, the craft person? What should we be doing for them?
Engaging more with them now. So I think the demand should first be placed on, say, media houses to produce material that is about these people. I think we don't see them enough, we don't hear them enough, so we're not moved by their plight. But one time when we go there and we sit with them and we see them, I think we will know. I think the first thing is the narrative around their lives has to be made more visible, and then I'm sure automatically the policymakers will act. So, and what do media houses say? They say nobody wants to read these stories. So somewhere we have to have that shift, happening from somebody wants to read these stories, so please write those stories, so those stories become visible, and then the change will automatically happen.
So what we also face as an academician, as a researcher, as a part of the policy making process as well, whatever is being done should be translated always into local languages. जैसे आपने काम किया है, तमिलनाडु के लिए किया, but अगर उसको local भाषा में हमने translate किया अलग-अलग प्रदेशों के लिए देखें, उसका लोग experience जो आपने किया है, people will also take their experience at this tribe, और उससे knowledge spread होती है. हर एक को हर जगह experiment करने की जरूरत नहीं है. आपने किया, आपने deep dive research किया, आपने पूरे प्रदेश में घूमी. तो आई थिंक आपकी किताब का ट्रांसलेशन भी होना चाहिए और हम आपसे ये भी रिक्वेस्ट करेंगे कि आप उसको 1-2 पेज का पॉलिसी ब्रीफ जैसा बनाएं. जो आपकी मेन फाइंडिंग्स हैं उसको आप पॉलिसी ब्रीफ की तरह बना के उसको डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करें अक्रॉस द कंट्री, डिफरेंट लैंग्वेजेस. आई थिंक दैट विल हैव अ great dent on the whole system. I think people's eyes will open up and then they will definitely have some solutions locally available to help these communities to do better and improve their own well-being and livelihoods, because they provide so much to us. बिना किसानों के, बिना artisans के, हम लोग we all appreciating each other's sarees and looking at the craft and art which is being put up. This is a festival of literature and art as well. So beautifully put up. So how they're getting back, उसके backward linkages क्या है, or what kind of support they would get. I think it's very essential to also take the value of the research forward, for translating things into simple language. इतनी बड़ी report कोई नहीं पढ़ पाएगा. हम लोग, of course, we are the avid readers, we read the entire book, we read that. But for the usefulness of the book will be much more if we can take out some extracts, not just in English, in local languages as well. I think very good thing to have that. This is an amazing book. To me, it's like an academic reading for me. I understood the concepts, understood the whole theory behind it, and she substantiated the theory with lots of examples of some case study across. So it's amazing connect, and I think we have lots of student population sitting here, and they can agree with me. This should be definitely done, and congratulations once again, Aparna.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having me and Dr.
Do we have any questions from the Can I ask in Hindi also?
My Hindi is, I can understand Hindi. I speak a little bit, which I think is Hindi.
So it's a very simple one. In the conversation somewhere you said that men are stupid farmers. You know, it's a fact, nobody needs to prove it. But what is that makes them, really the differentiator? I mean, the women better in the farming sector.
Not better, they're more visible.
Okay.
So, in the sense that men are more visible. When we say the word farmer, we always think of a man.
Right.
So it is just that, women are working harder. They only own 13% of the farmland, which means 87% of the farmland is owned by men. But more than 70% of the work is done by women. And they're not able to get any credit for the work, without the ownership of land.
Right.
So, it really disadvantages them greatly. But when we say farmer, we always think of a man. So all the interventions are done keeping a male farmer in mind. So even let's say, a loan, right? We say go to the bank and get a loan. Women are not able to access it, right? So it is all very male-centric, our policy interventions. So we have to take the actual data, which is that women are doing much of the work. I'm sure Pamela will agree with that. So they are doing much of the work, but they're not getting, not getting the benefit of that work. They're not able to access things, to make their work better.
Isn't that true for other sectors also? It is, largely a very male-centric point of view.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In farming, it is worse, sir, because of the ownership problem. Like I said, it's 13% versus 87%. That's a huge, especially because 70% of the work is done by women. So you don't have this kind of, I could be wrong, but I don't know if this kind of disparity exists across sectors.
Got your point. Thank you.
I think it would be Himalayan states. I've done a lot of work across these states. You will find most of the farming individuals are women farmers, women definitely. Because men would move away, चले जाते हैं वहाँ दूसरे occupations में, maybe on different services, maybe to urban areas. और पहाड़ों में ज़्यादातर आपको women ही दिखेंगे. जो आपने like example देते if you imagine somebody sowing seeds or somebody planting rice, saplings, they are women. वही पिक्चर आप गूगल भी करेंगे ना तो वो पिक्चर सामने आती है. So this is what but things are changing. We interview lots of women across the country for our work as well. So जो पहले झगड़ा लैंड राइट का था, they realized कि वो काफी झगड़ा हो चुका है. Instead of sticking to land, they just shift to more important things to improve technology, improve interventions, access to loans, and organizing women for when they're together they can definitely engage better. They can bargain better, definitely. So collectiveness is coming amongst women, definitely. There's still a lot to be done. बहुत अभी दिल्ली बहुत दूर है उसके लिए फर्स्ट शुरुआत डेफिनेटली हो चुकी है.
पंजाब की विमेन के ट्रैक्टर चलाते हुए फोटो ज्यादा सर्कुलेट कर रही है.
Do we have any questions?
अपर्णा जी, बहुत ही अच्छा था आपका, और अपेरेंटली आप जो है वो ग्राउंड से रिलेटेड है और आपका जो इनसाइट्स है वो एक लार्जर पिक्चर प्रेजेंट करता है. और मेरे ख्याल से मधु जी से बेटर आपको डिस्कशंस जो है वो इतनी अप्रोप्रिएट है. बहुत ही अच्छा डिस्कशन रहा और बहुत ही अच्छा लगा आपको सुन के आपका काम. और ये लाइवलीहुड के ऊपर बहुत सारे लोग काम कर रहे हैं, पर लाइवलीहुड का कल्चर से जो रिलेशनशिप है उसमें आपने ब्रीफली उसको समझाया है कि एक लाइवलीहुड से पूरा कल्चर बदलता है और आप उसको यदि वैनिश होने देंगे तो पूरा के पूरा जो कल्चर जिसके हम लोग बहुत ही प्राउड फील करते हैं और अपने शोल्डर पे कैरी करते हैं इंडियन कल्चर, तो वो सब के सब एक फॉल्स फ्लैट. और आपने पाम जो टैपर्स की बात की, तो मेरा थोड़ा सा एक्सपीरियंस है, मैं क्वेश्चन नहीं पूछ रही हूँ, ज़्यादा बता रही हूँ, उस पर आपने इलैबोरेट जितना करना चाहें उतना वील अप्रिशिएट. बट पाम टैपिंग है, पूरी टेक्नोलॉजी है और एक रिलेशनशिप है उस व्यक्ति का उस पेड़ के साथ. तो जब वो टैप करते हैं, आपको तो मालूम होगा, मैं आपको क्या बताऊँ, पर जब एक फार्मर जो टैपर है वो टैप करता है तब साथ निकलता है, और कभी कभी वो पेड़ नहीं देता है साथ, तो वो पेड़ कैसा रिस्पॉन्ड करेगा वो टैपर के साथ, वो एक बहुत इंटीमेट रिलेशन है. और वो तो पूरा की पूरा एक तो सिर्फ कल्चर ही नहीं है ना, वो पूरा फीलिंग्स, इमोशंस, उसका सबका एक वो है, एक पैकेज है, और एक को इंटरफियर कर दिया तो वो एक, सबसे पहले तो मैं बहुत धन्यवाद देती हूँ आपका, बहुत ही अच्छा लेक्चर सुनने को मुझे मिला आपका किताब के ऊपर, और मधु जी ने बहुत ही रेलिवेंट क्वेश्चंस पूछे। कल्चर के साथ रिलेशन के ऊपर आप कुछ बोलना चाहें तो मैं जरूर चाहूँगी कि आप बताएं। This is on the relationship between livelihood and culture of a place. If you would like to throw light on that, please. Thank you.
So everything that we eat, so whatever we eat, whatever we worship, whatever we wear, what are our leisure activities, all this forms the backbone of culture. And none of this can exist without the people who, all these rest on the backs of people's livelihoods. Right? So, our saris, whether it's our musical instruments, or whether it's the temples, or, other religions, and, how we worship them, or even the buildings, everything is, a livelihood, right? And the moment we start looking at the interconnectedness between that livelihood and the culture, we understand, and also how, closely linked this is to, let's say, every monsoon, and how, all this is part of the agrarian world. We realize the importance of keeping farming alive so that these cultures, these livelihoods stay alive, so that our culture is intact. And this is, what is a conflict here is that some of this is mired in caste. So it's very hard to go and tell somebody who's been doing this for generations, only because they're born in a certain caste. You can't go and tell them, why can't your son or daughter do this? It's the same thing to me, right? Like my son or daughter, my daughter, she's free to choose and do whatever she wants to do. She doesn't have to follow my footsteps. It's the same thing for somebody else's son or daughter. But do they have the same resources? Do they have the same privileges? Do they have the access to the same things that somebody else's son or daughter does? So I mean, these are very complex questions, I suppose, but that's, in a small nutshell, the linkage between livelihood and culture.
Do we have any other questions?
How do we then get others' children to come into this profession? I mean, like, I can't let my children go out of the village.
Right.
But then how do others get attracted? Because हमारी संस्कृति से जुड़ना और इसको, otherwise it again becomes some statistics, some research which stays in a book.
Right.
How do we convert it into something which is going to get something out? Especially for the children to move into this.
Right. So three things, ma'am. I mean, one is economics. It has to be viable, it has to be profitable. What happens now is that things become, appropriated by people who are living in cities. For example, you must have seen in some years ago on Facebook, there was this 100 sari pact. Everybody was wearing handloom saris. You see that the weaver community, nobody is wearing handloom saris. They're all wearing synthetic saris. So what has happened is a lot of things are getting appropriated. Millets are being eaten by people from higher classes, right? By people in the cities. People in the villages are not eating millets because they see it as a poor man's food. They no longer want to eat the millet, right? And now we have to Tamil Nadu, this time's budget, they've given 92 crores to make millets popular. 3 generations ago, people would have laughed at this. But now we need that interventions, right? Because millet is climate resilient. So first is profitability. Second thing is the stigmas have to go. Caste associated stigmas have to go. The moment we say that only this caste person does this work, it becomes something that is deeply stigmatized and deeply problematic. Whether it is caste or religion, as you know, they are very loaded political things in our country. So how do we break that? We have to break the caste hierarchy. Right? And for something to become really popular, there has to be a prestige in doing it. So how do we bring the prestige by having a GI tag, maybe, or giving awards to people? Then there is a prestige in doing it. So I think these 3 things will actually turn the wheel, but it is a long and slow process.
It also connects me to Dr. Nirada's question and what she was trying to write. The culture, I would say, the music. But every activity, of farmer or these artisans have got music built into it. Different songs, when the palm jaggery, climber goes up, he also sings, There's a beautiful music when he climbs music. I've seen that in Kerala. Gradually climbs and music is different. He's just humming and he's converted to full song when he's at the top. So that's the connect they're making, and then look at the women farmers that are sowing, saplings, sowing seeds, and they're planting saplings. They're happy, we have harvest festivals, and cuisine is there. So I think it will disappear. And you very rightly mentioned in your book also that even their children, they would not be eating millets and the traditional food is switching to noodles, Maggi, and a couple of other things. So this is what is disappearing. And when the livelihood goes, things has completely crashed out of the system. So that's why likely you pointed out these things in your book. So thank you.
Please pass on the mic to the lady here.
No, I just wanted to make a couple of points other than question. Hello. One was the values. Up till now there have been so many feudal values in which everything, all production is mired, and Madam Aparna has brought out some of them, voting the gender and the caste question. So I'm saying that there have been communities which are outside the caste system, for example the Adivasis. And we see in the Adivasis, like I've seen in the bills, that if they have to get a wood for their hut, which is falling down, or they have to get even for the holy burning, or they have to, for any purpose, any tree, any land, they propitiate that. They worship that. And what does that mean? It means that there's gratitude. So the relationship of gratitude with our resources makes, and they say this, they say, हम कामपूर्ति के लिए करते हैं. आज लकड़ी ले रहे हैं तो कामपूर्ति के लिए. And it's not just consumption and overconsumption and so on. So I think that until those democratic, or in the Adivasi villages, we find that if somebody has to build a house, then the 40 families will get together and the house gets built in one day. Or weeding. There are two types of collective shram practices in the one is where they give a feast and the other where they don't give a feast. So everybody comes, from every house one person will come. And at the end of the day, then the family which is called everybody will, serve some rice and something, and in the other one, there won't be a feast, but they will share. So because of that, like the entire fields of one person will get done in leaving his own. So these values of collectivism and democratic values and gratitude and awe in our relationship with nature. These are values which we must learn and have in the rest of society has to use that to move forward. And the other thing I wanted to say was that not only economic, I think one very main question today is political. The question of livelihoods is a political question. In the last 1 year, we have seen 700 plus people die. 700 farmers die. What was our response? What was the response of society, of young people? Were we busy in our WhatsApps and our Facebooks? What happened? And so all they're asking for is the 3 farm laws had to be repealed, the black laws. Because right now the fight in livelihoods is between the super profit-seeking corporates and the individual farmers, peasants, craftspersons, artisans, and so on. And there has to be some midway. There have to be other modes like cooperatives, even production companies of farmers, and so on. So I think that is a very important thing, and we must all support, even those, everybody who eats food must support food producers.
The audience is as intellectual as the speakers. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Meera Dasji to present a token of thanks to both of us, to the discussant. Please give a round of applause. Now I'd like to call Ms. Meenakshi Daji to present the token of thanks to the discussant.
Yeah.
Please give it a round of applause. I'd like to thank both of the speakers for such a wonderful and informative session.